The amount of money I've spent on just compliance, just to get to the table, is in the millions.
I'm sure that you sleep a lot better given the investment you've made in compliance than an operator of a startup who's operating in a complete gray space and doesn't know who's going to knock on their door tomorrow.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of the Business of Betting podcast. Today, I am joined with Jeff Ifrah. If you haven't heard of him, he's a power broker behind the scenes in sports betting. He's been involved in a lot of the initiatives that have created the industry as we know it today in the United States. He was instrumental in crafting the New Jersey legislation. He's been very instrumental with a lot of the big names that you know that are involved in DFS. He recently became a grandfather. And yeah, welcome very much to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right into it. So one of the big results recently is the U.S. election. Obviously, there's a big sea change going from Democratic to Republican. Republicans are going to control the House. Why don't we kick off by what are your reactions to the Trump administration and the new shift rightwards vis-a-vis sports betting? Do you think things are going to be changing from that perspective?
You know, it's interesting across the country and in Washington, D.C. on the federal level. There's always been bipartisan support for sports betting, so it's not really a Republican or Democrat issue. I do think that the Republicans are a little more in favor of free markets and a little less inclined to look at regulation and increased regulation as a form of government and regulation. So I actually think that we're not going to see a lot of changes, and we're certainly not going to see negative changes in the new administration.
So jumping into the New Jersey legislation, a few months ago, I had Bill Pascrell on the podcast, who I'm sure you are very familiar with and worked with very closely. And one of the issues I had in sort of the New Jersey legislation is this idea of skins. You know, I call it like airport slots or extortion, whatever you want to call it. You know, if you take the lens of like Republicans being free market and that kind of thing, do you take sort of a Bill Pascrell, like what he basically said is this is the political reality on the ground that you need to have a skin to get the casinos along. They carry a lot of water in this state. What's your general commentary on why skins exist and why it's a good idea? From my perspective, it's very anti-free market.
Well, it is anti-free market, but as Bill said, it is the reality on the ground. The casinos were there first. The casinos support a lot of jobs. So my look at it would be that regulators and legislators are practical and pragmatic. The first and most important thing is the existing economy. They're not going to pass legislation and displace the existing economy in place of some future economy. So if you have casinos on the ground that are already supporting the economy, they're already supporting jobs, they provide entertainment, they help support the local community, it's going to be a real uphill battle in any state in the country to make an argument that a cloud-based company from overseas who will put 5 to 10 employees in your state should take priority over that existing retail land, brick and mortar space. It's something that really hurts the ability of online companies to compete in this space. And it certainly hurts them to be able to take market share away from the offshore companies in order to share revenue and share space with those land-based entities. That is not something that online companies have to do overseas or in the UK, as you know. And so it affects the bottom line and it can affect the customer experience. So for all those reasons, it's terrible, but it's not going away.
So your point of view is it's philosophically, it's a bad idea, but it's just the political reality of the situation on the ground.
I think that there are some states that don't have casinos and there are some states that have so few casinos that those casinos don't have oversized power like they do in New Jersey and elsewhere. In those states, it's certainly possible that you can have what's referred to as an untethered sports betting or iCasino license where the operator does not need to tie its future to a land-based casino or a sports team.
I would argue, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts. I realize this is not a super persuasive argument, but I think sports betting has nothing to do with casino. So even though you could make an argument that casinos have jobs and they have an establishment, to me, they're completely different industries and people sort of lump them all together. I don't know why, because to me, operating a casino is nothing about operating a sportsbook. To me, sportsbooks more akin to financial trading and gambling is casinos are more akin to like playing a game in a group setting for money, and they're completely different activities. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that in the UK and Europe, there has been some, precedent for what you're saying. Some products that look like gambling products are regulated as financial instruments and financial products by a different regulator. And, in the United States and at the federal and state level, we have different regulators. There are products that can come out to the market that could be regulated by the Gaming Commission, or in the case of, New Jersey, the Division of Gaming Enforcement, or the New Jersey Gaming Commission, it could be regulated by them. It could also be regulated by the Department of Banking and Insurance. It could be regulated by the lottery. It could be regulated in some states by the Horse Racing Commission. So there are, that's not the path that it took in the United States. But I think you're right. If someone would have gone through a different pathway to market and have said, hey, these are financial instruments, let's regulate them like that, under state securities laws or something, then maybe they could have avoided the pairing with the casinos. I think the origin of that pair is really Las Vegas. It's not New Jersey, because in Las Vegas, there were retail sports books and kiosks. In the casino, it was part of the casino experience, but for very few people, but it was a part of that experience. But again, such a minority that I think it's true. Your point is a big one. It didn't really need to be tied together that way at the get-go, but that was the pathway to licensing. And in fact, that's what happened in New Jersey, Delaware, and as I said, Nevada right off the bat.
Well, I'll live in my optimistic dream that America will correct that. But I think pragmatically speaking, it's, as to your point, it's here to stay, the status quo. Pivoting to other models, sweepstakes, and I think you do some work for sweepstakes companies. I'd be curious to get your legal take on that, because from my perspective, sweepstakes seems too good to be true. It seems that you can kind of skip all these sort of annoying casino deals and local state regulations. What's your take? I'm more interested on the sports side than the casino side. What's your legal perspective of why or why not sweepstakes is viable?
So we don't actually do any work for sweepstakes in the sports space. We don't represent operators who offer sweepstakes on a sports basis. That's not to say I wouldn't, try to defend the matter. We also have a litigation practice. And so we do have arbitrations. We have a class action practice, and we do defend all sorts of, alleged regulatory violations. There are a number of cases that we have right now in the office defending operators in the sweep space, but those are exclusively on the casino side. We don't have any clients on the sports side. And maybe that allows me to speak more freely about it. I don't know, but I just want to clarify that we don't actually do that. I think that you're right. I mean, offering sweeps in the sports space does alleviate, number one, there's no state regulation, which means I'm not sure the state regulation would be the problem. The issue is you can go to market without licensing, without pairing with that casino, without revenue share agreements. I mean, you're talking about alleviating across the country hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing and registration fees to go to market as and start competing as essentially a sports betting operator, with the difference that you have this, free entry mode. So it's quite a remarkable jump to whoever went to market with it, and what the future will be, I don't know. There are some barriers. There are legal arguments. It's just a question of, are regulators going to jump up and take this up as their issue? There is a push among, obviously people watch, social media, and there is a push among the opposition to try to get state attorney generals involved and others. I don't, to date, that hasn't been the case. There's only been really less than a handful of regulators who have said, hey, leave our state. We don't like this. But that's an option for, AGs. And I think that if they step up and do that, the operators would comply. But so far, they haven't done that.
And do you have a take on why they're so slow to react to this? Is it just sort of like this is novel law and they don't have an answer? Or is this the 58th important thing on their desk and, who gives a shit? Like, why do you think that they haven't issued an opinion? Because there's some serious money flowing through sweepstakes these days.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And it's, it's always difficult because a lot of times we get clients at the firm who are like, I want to offer XYZ. And I'm like, well, you can't do that. Well, Polymarket does it. And I'm like, okay, well, just stand in line and let's wait and see what happens to them. And so when the FBI seized his phones and went to his house, I was just like, okay, that's the beginning of something. So I don't know. You say that there's serious money flowing through. So are they big enough to be on a regulator's radar? Maybe some of them are in terms of volume of dollars, right? Because that's an important factor. A regulator's not going to take up a big case against, a quasi-legal operator when there's not a lot of money there. I do think that consumer protection plays into it. And I do think that regulators would prefer to take up cases where people are being victimized or vulnerable victims to a particular thing. So I do think that the operators in the industry have been very careful to adopt and avoid deceptive advertising, which is a way to draw in a regulator. They've avoided a lot. I mean, look at all the things that happened to the regulated sports books when they said, free play or offered bonuses or promotions, or when they said you can't lose. I mean, the regulators swooped in on them like they were like trying to sell like some, who knows what kind of product. But on the sweep side, that hasn't happened. And so maybe that's a reason why the regulators have stayed back. I think one reason is that there's so much regulated gaming now on the state and federal level that I think maybe if I was a regulator, I'd really want to be sure that this is 100% illegal before I did anything. And, promotions and sweepstakes have in fact been around forever. So, I mean, we got a call once about a sweepstakes operator in Maryland where I live, and I spoke to the Maryland Lottery about it. And I said, you guys have a statute on promotions and sweepstakes. Like, you keep telling me this is illegal gambling, but how does it violate your statute? Like, they didn't know they had a statute on promotions and sweepstakes. And whether it violates it or not will be for another day. They sort of just kind of abandoned the matter. But this isn't something that's operating like in a complete vacuum and void of anything. And there are other verticals that are, but there is at least a basis. And you can argue with that basis. And the opposition have, said all these things about how there's no hamburger, or there's no this, there's no that. You can make those arguments. But there is a foundation for promotions and sweepstakes in the country. So if I'm a regulator, maybe I'm thinking like, do I want to get involved in this? Do I want to understand this? But I don't know for sure. It's a very good question, Jason. I don't know, what at the end of the day motivates a regulator to bring a case. I can only guess.
I'm sure this is why you have a thriving practice, but as a small operator, it's really hard to navigate all these things because on one hand, you have this sort of like blue sky regulatory framework. I put regulatory framework in quotes because to your point, there are statutes about sweepstakes and if you kind of squint one eye, like perhaps sports betting can fit through that hole. On the other hand, you have the front door of the regulated sports betting market, which is incredibly cumbersome, incredibly expensive. I mean, you have to pay the casinos, you have to pay GLI, you have to do all the compliance. Each state is annoyingly different. The amount of money I've spent on just compliance, just to get to the table, is in the millions. That has nothing to do with running the sports book or acquiring customers or any of that. It's just like millions for table stakes just to sort of be in the market. So, and then you're sort of stuck, like you see all these sort of success stories about, this company, that company, doing at least by reputation very well on the money side. And then you have the legal side is sort of crowded out by DraftKings and FanDuel. And it's very confusing how to operate that. Like, do you do both? Do you pick one lane? Do you have two companies?
And you have to decide as a startup what level of risk you're comfortable with going to sleep at night. And I'm sure that you sleep a lot better given the investment you've made in compliance than an operator of a startup who's operating in a complete gray space and doesn't know who's going to knock on their door tomorrow. So I think that's the best I can tell you to reward your investment in compliance. It's certainly not the easy way to go. And it can be super frustrating when a startup in that space is doing 100 to 200 million in their first year, which is happening. And when the margins are so much higher than the margins you take home after that huge investment, and trying to get market share away from, the bigger operators. I mean, in the US, Missouri is going to open potentially. It's interesting little point. Maybe no one's said this before on a podcast, but everyone was excited because Missouri voters went to the election voting on, legalizing sports betting, and everyone celebrated that the bill passed and the regulator was instructed to pass regulations by December 1st. Well, it turns out that as we slowly count all the votes, it's getting closer on the issue of the proposition to have sports betting in Missouri. And in fact, it's so close that we may not actually have a result on whether Missouri actually passed sports betting before the end of the year. So there are not probably going to be regulations December 1st in Missouri. But if Missouri does go live, they're supposed to go live some point next year, in the middle of the year. There will be very few operators operating there because they didn't authorize that many operators here's what I wanted to say. On day one in Missouri, we already know that DraftKings and FanDuel will have 85% of the market on day one, maybe more, but I'm saying at a minimum. So how do you, as a startup, small business who's trying to capture market share, go into a market like that, convincing your shareholders, hey, it's worth competing with 20 other people for 1%? How do you do that? I mean, that's the constant frustration of trying to compete with, what people often call a duopoly. And that's tough. And, every time, Jason, I go into a state to discuss iGaming legislation, because we have a trade group that promotes iGaming legislation. So these would be, some people call them iTable, also live casino dealer, but also slots, online slots, and also poker. And when we go there, everyone wants to talk about small business. When I was in DC, what are you going to do for small business? Well, what are you going to do for small business, Mr. or Mrs. Regulator? Are you going to set aside skins? Are you going to make it more favorable? Don't just say you're giving one skin or one license to a small business who has to then compete with extremely high licensing fees, right? And supplier costs that are out the wazoo. It's not enough. It's not going to happen. So, if you want to say, what's the problem here? Why isn't small business participating? You got to look at the way you regulate the industry.
So I know you were quite instrumental in the New Jersey legislation, and the industry should thank you for all the effort, because that sort of paved the way for the industry that's being built today in the United States in a legal fashion. One of my perspectives is that the UK kind of does it right. Like, anybody can sign up for a gambling license. You pay your 20K, 40K, 50K. I don't know what it is these days. You follow the legislation and you can go live, whether it's iCasino or sports betting. Did you consider that model? Because to me, that's the perfect model, because it evens the playing field between large operators, small operators. If you want to start a sports betting company, the UK is a great place to do it. It's sort of a level playing field. It's open door. Anybody can do it. It's fit and proper and follows the blah, blah, blah. Did you look at that model and think it wouldn't work in New Jersey? Because to me, it's like this, well, I guess we sort of going around in circles a little bit with the skin idea, but the skin is such a market killer. Like, ultimately, the end consumer is the loser. The less choice that a consumer has, the more price purchasing power the big players have, and the consumer is the one who ends up paying for that.
Yeah, it's only getting worse. I mean, I think that all options were considered, and I hear you that it does feel anti-competitive to require an online company. But at the end of the day, let me say it this way: no state is going to adopt the free market, anyone can play policy and philosophy of the UK where you are. And that's unfortunate. And that's the way it's been since day one. And that's why it's so difficult to try to participate in any type of regulated online space in the US. On the other hand, online companies have to deal with the fact that there are existing industries and retail industries in the space. Now, I mean, you could say, like, when Amazon wanted to launch, there weren't any problems. Like, it's not like Walmart was able to say, hey, wait a minute, large warehouses being in every single door, being able to provide deliveries, that's our market. And Amazon grew that way, and Walmart was late to the story, and Amazon took over, and the rest is history. But that's not, when it comes to gaming, there is this overlay of consumer protection that allows regulators, and there's this historical opposition on moral grounds to gaming, despite the fact that 44 states or so have land-based casinos. So all of that comes together to paint not a very good picture when you're trying to pass online legislation. And you make concessions, and the concessions in New Jersey were bad. But you have to remember that in the United States, when an industry is failing, we tend to try and shore it up rather than let it fail. And that's the real core problem. Atlantic City had so many casinos, and they were failing, and they continued to fail even after the online legislation. There were 3 more that were shuttered after New Jersey passed online casino legislation. So there were way too many casinos in Atlantic City. The time had passed. And instead of just letting that industry kind of move on and entering a new phase of online, they decided to essentially help the casinos by essentially overburdening the new entry to the market. And that's not really a free market. And that's not really the way that you generally welcome new entrants to a market. You sort of pass the torch to the new guy and then say, okay, you go and help generate revenue for us. But that's not what happened. And so, despite the fact that people weren't going to Atlantic City anymore, despite the fact that these rooms in the hotels were empty, despite the fact that some of the casinos were literally gone from 4-star quality down to 1-star, the legislature decided that they needed to help them out. And the truth is, I wrote an article about this when we passed the legislation. Online legislation continued to have opposition in Atlantic City, And it saved Atlantic City, and they should have brought it and they should have introduced it years earlier. They could have saved more. They could have saved more casinos, but it wasn't the path forward.
Well, as my dad says, I will continue to pound sand about this and grit my teeth. You mentioned Polymarket. They kind of blew up for this election, and it was interesting to see how Kalshi blew up under a CFTC regulatory framework, and Polymarket blew up off a YOLO legal framework. What's your take on, I think Kalshi was, just for the audience, if you're not familiar, CFTC regulates commodities, more commonly wheat and pork bellies and things like that. And for the longest time, it's sort of been considered that event futures and political contracts tend to be considered event futures. They should be regulated under CFTC auspices. CFTC is always kind of against it, and Kalshi sued the CFTC and got a stay from a federal judge to say political contracts should be allowed under event contract law. So that's where we are. So the CFTC did not allow Kalshi to take wagers on political contracts. A federal judge did, and it's sort of in this limbo state right now as the case winds its way through court. Polymarket is some completely unregulated, I mean, the founder's onshore, but I don't know where the company is based. And they just sort of let anybody and don't KYC anybody and kind of take the YOLO legal strategy. And the founder got a visit from the FBI last week. I've been listening to a lot of takes, notably, I don't know if you listen to the All In podcast, but it's been very interesting that a lot of people think that the FBI visited the founder of Polymarket because it was sort of retribution for the election, which I think is just ridiculous. I think it could be, called doing their job and following the law, because Polymarket was fined by the CFTC for allowing Americans to bet, and it's no secret that Americans have continued to wager on Polymarket. So that was a long way to set that up for the audience, because I think you and I follow this really closely, and maybe not everybody follows this really closely. Now that we set the scene, what's your take on both of those cases, on the sort of legal thumbs up route from the Kalshi side and the YOLO legal strategy on the Polymarket side?
That was a really good summary. I mean, that was a lot of complicated legal battles that you summarized for everyone, so that was very well done. No legalese too, so I think everyone can follow that. So listen, that position that you mentioned, Polymarket itself is telling the public that their CEO and founder was, essentially subject to that seizure order in his house in New York as a result of, First Amendment issues, violations, and essentially participating in the election. And this is the FBI. I mean, the FBI doesn't get upset over election results and arrest people. That's kind of silly. I mean, I've spent almost 30 years defending white collar executives against charges where the FBI is the arresting agency. And they do a lot of things that I don't agree with, but they don't take political positions and then take political prisoners. It's pretty obvious, I think, to anyone who's paying attention that, that the election ended up raising the profile of Polymarket. And as a result of that, the government became aware that Polymarket was offering unregulated bets on the election, which, by the way, without CFTC permission, violate the law in 44 states. So one of the big impediments and barriers to Kalshi going forward with the CFTC was that the CFTC said, hey, election betting is illegal in 44 states. We can't just give you permission to offer this nationally through one of our, commodities contract markets. It doesn't work that way. So Kalshi ultimately won the day on that because, like you said, a federal judge disagreed that the CFTC had the discretion to tell Kalshi, hey, you otherwise fit in the scheme of all these future markets and oranges and agriculture and everything like you said, but we're going to keep you on the sideline anyway. So the judge is like, no, you can't do that. They fit. Polymarket also fits, but they never chose to go forward with the CFTC. They didn't register. So the CFTC would argue that the Polymarket is essentially an illegal, unregistered exchange. And the CFTC has brought parallel cases with the FBI in the past. And I would not be surprised that the CFTC essentially has probably a pending civil case that they have not unsealed while this criminal case makes its way through the system. And this is the beginning of it. And, normally companies like Polymarket don't have their CEOs living in New York and being on social media and talking about how great they are. Normally they're overseas, they're in Cyprus. I mean, we saw with binary options, the same thing happened, but all of those people were in Cyprus, or they were registered with CySec, or they claimed they had financial instruments and they weren't considered gambling. So the CFTC had an incredible amount of cases, 10 years ago in that market, even though those products were regulated in the UK, but they weren't in the US. And so some individuals and CEOs got 20 years in jail for that, for offering unregulated binary options in the US. So this story, for people saying, oh, unregulated people can make billions of dollars, wait to see how this story plays out. Let's see what happens. I want to see how good anyone feels about what's going to happen to this company and the CEO. I don't think it's going to be a good ending. On the Kalshi side, that's like a dream come true. The CEO and co-founder of Kalshi, he put everything into this case and, got to give him incredible credit and incredible kudos for staying the course and seeing it through and finding a way to win, which he did. Another winner was Robinhood, which kind of gets left out of the conversation. Kalshi got those contracts approved, but Robinhood adopted the same contracts through its CFTC partner. And they traded, almost the same amount as Kalshi did over the course of the 7 or 11 days before the election when they were allowed to trade. So they both made out like bandits, I would say. And I think Kalshi is going to continue to do well. As you know, they went to the number one app in the App Store after a week and a half of being essentially legally able to offer those products. So it's a great story.
Yeah, I tip my hat to Kalshi because, short of political trading, I don't think that there's a lot of demand for random non-political event markets outside of sports. So, sports are obviously the biggest application of event markets, but that's not permissible under the CFTC. And what's the interest rate going to do in the UK is not as interesting of a contract as, who's going to win the next election. So I tip my hat to them. Years ago, I moved to the US and we engaged with the CFTC we were going to go the no action letter route, which is what Predictit did. For those of you that don't know, their prediction markets have been around forever in the United States, going back 20, 30 years. Kalshi, I think wrongly has said they were the first sort of real money prediction market in the US. That's not the case. There's been the Iowa election market and there's been Predictit. And both of those operate under a legal framework called no action letter, basically saying that if you do it with these circumstances, we'll leave you alone about this. Those circumstances happen to be quite restrictive. The amount you can deposit, the number of traders per market is quite small. So they're kind of like toy markets, but we've had that legal framework forever. And I just thought that when I was looking at the no action route, I just thought it was too small of numbers to really be worth the effort to go through all that. But well done to Kalshi. I never would have thought that they would have gotten political markets approved, which I think absolutely should be. It's really funny how America can be so forward thinking on some things and so conservative on other things. And from a technology perspective, we're like top of the world. And then when it comes to gambling, it feels like we're in the Stone Age or something. It's like people aren't betting on sports already, or people aren't trading on the election. Just look at the UK. All this stuff is freely legal and they have no problems with corruption. Well, there was a famous case 2 months ago where some politicians bet illegally, but they were discovered, they got in trouble. They're fined and sanctioned, and the world moves on. This should be regulated and just like any other market. So well done to them. I'm impressed that sports are illegal in the United States. Political betting is, at least for the time being, legal in the United States. So it feels like a new dawn, and I hope we don't screw it up as a country.
Yeah, there were a lot of concerns by the regulator that they were not going to be able to maintain the integrity of the market, the election market. So you bring up that UK case. So that type of case, that's enough to blow a regulator's mind. How do I ensure that these markets are functioning with integrity? I'm concerned that there's no monitoring of these elections. Of course there's monitoring. That's what the whole Trump, Biden 2020 election was about, right? But there was a lot of congressional opposition to these political market, event futures because they were so concerned that someone was going to somehow be able to interfere with an election in order to essentially win their bet. And that happens in sports betting too. You always hear about, these players and the coaches and the refs, there's no integrity in the market. We don't really know. Injuries don't get to the market fast enough. So you have that type of stuff. At the end of the day, that argument is still an argument on appeal, by the way, Jason. They're still arguing to the Court of Appeals that in the DC circuit that, hey, we are really not the right regulator for this because we can't guarantee that there's not going to be interference in the election as a result of these bets. And so you mentioned that UK case, and it was taken care of. But if a scandal like that happened here, I think the whole market would be shut down. The US doesn't do well with stuff like that.
I totally get the political considerations, but logistically, it's just ridiculous. It's like insider trading. Just because somebody does insider trading, we don't stop the stock market. People do bad things. People cheat on their taxes. People cheat at golf. We don't stop golf because people put it. do a mulligan in the middle of the fairway. You just kind of keep moving with life, like regulate it, have transparency, have, some government regulation, and we all move on with our lives
Yeah. But you're fighting with a regulator who they don't collect taxes. They don't get paid. They don't increase their budget because they take on a new vertical, right? So you're dealing with pushback by a lot of federal employees because they're not interested in taking on a whole new market and starting to increase their workloads, all while their budget stays the same and they're not collecting taxes on the underlying revenue and deposits. So it's unfortunately the reality of the way government staffers and employees look at new markets.
Yeah. Pivoting to crypto, and these are honest questions. For as much as I sort of know about crypto on the technical side, I know very little about crypto on the legal side. What is the sort of status quo about using crypto to bet on sports in the United States? Is it a no-fly zone, or can you do it under certain circumstances?
There's nothing. I would say there is nothing. There's no reason, and there's nothing stopping from a regulatory perspective. The only thing that's stopping it is that regulators haven't approved it. Now, why haven't they approved it? The American Gaming Association years ago put out this notice that no one in the casino industry should accept crypto until the Treasury Department weighs in on, is it considered money and how is it regulated? Is it, do we, all of this stuff. I don't know why they did that. There was nothing from Treasury saying they needed to do that. Coinbase went and did an IPO. I mean, they still have a lawsuit from the SEC on whether or not they're an illegal exchange because some of the tokens are considered to be securities. But the issue of whether crypto can function in society appears to have already, left the station. And yet the gaming regulators seem to be the last ones who are holding back. Now, why are they holding back? I think they're holding back first because they didn't, that the industry is really young. I've spoken to a lot of the head regulators, and there's been flexibility. They have Colorado and Pennsylvania. When the waning days of Barstool, David Portnoy said, hey, I've got approvals to go live with crypto in Colorado and Pennsylvania. And he unfortunately left the market soon after, and there hasn't been anything on Penn ESPN Bet to take over that conch from him. But the only thing really stopping them is the regulators don't want a scandal, and they're not sure how, current banks will view the fact that their clients, their merchants, are accepting crypto. That's really the problem. So if DraftKings and FanDuel were suddenly to accept crypto, would that interfere with their banking relationships? Would MasterCard and Visa now say, well, wait a minute, our customers accept crypto? How does that change things? Now, you and I would say, well, it doesn't change anything. We would just apply our anti-money laundering rules and bank secrecy and KYC to our crypto customers. And so then they're going to be like, oh, is that really possible? Well, it's possible enough that Coinbase and Kraken do it every single day. So I think it's possible. But that's kind of the type of response you get. We're not ready for it. We don't know what the consequences will be. The banks don't like it. We have enough problems, Jason, onboarding customers now. Do we really want their journey to be interfered with further by having banks start hiccuping because, the merchant that they onboarded years ago is now accepting crypto? So all of those things come to bear. I will say that we have made some progress with certain regulators. There are certain products where the consumer can convert the crypto into fiat before they go on to and deposit on the operator. And if that journey can be done quickly enough so that there's not friction with the customer onboarding, that could be a pathway forward for people who, look, those customers are going to be good customers for you, right? People who hold crypto tend to fill out, to check some boxes of a customer that's a typical customer for you. And I think that, customers that hold crypto would probably become pretty successful sports bettors. We know they're doing it with crypto on other sites that accept crypto. So why not bring those customers over and make that a little easier for you to get some better traffic? But it's been very, very slow, and no one's really taking up the banner of, make this happen now.
Great. Before I let you go, one question I like to ask all the guests: what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, I never thought I was going to be a gaming lawyer, and I didn't know anything about sports betting. So that would definitely not have been on my checklist. You're asking me now? I don't know. I think what you're doing is fascinating. I think, although I'm sure it's very, very frustrating, I think what you're doing is amazing. I think that would be very cool to kind of pivot to, to a business where I've been representing individuals, but instead of being the lawyer for it, be managing it. How's that?
That's great. Well, there's no wrong answer, so it's whatever comes to mind.
Well, that's good. That's good.
I love this question because it's you can learn a lot about somebody by how they answer it. So that's why I like to ask it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for stopping by. I learned some stuff about the legal framework and great takes and perspectives. And thanks for sharing it with the audience.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy your podcast. I enjoyed listening last week or so when you had Sue on. She's a great pioneer along with Bill in the market. You've got great guests.
Great. Awesome. Thanks very much.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.